Good evening. I'm Jason Calvert, and this is the Historytellers. As the 17th century wore on, the crude encampments of the first colonists slowly gave way to permanent settlements. Durable and distinctive ways of life emerged, as Europeans and Africans adapted to the New World, and as Native Americans adapted to the newcomers. Even the rigid doctrines of Puritanism softened somewhat in response to the circumstances of life in America. Though all the colonies remained tied to England, and all were stitched tightly into the fabric of an Atlantic economy, regional differences continued to crystallize, notably the increasing importance of slave labor to the Southern way of life. Starting our show off tonight is Alexander Ryan reporting on the horrific living conditions that existed along the unhealthy Chesapeake region.
Life in the American wilderness was nasty, brutish, and short for the earliest Chesapeake settlers. Malaria, dysentery, and typhoid took a cruel toll, cutting 10 years off the life expectancy of newcomers from England. Half the people born in early Virginia and Maryland did not survive to celebrate their 20th birthdays. Few of the remaining half lived to see their 50th or even their 40th if they were women. The disease-ravaged settlements of the Chesapeake grew only slowly in the 17th century, mostly through fresh immigration from England. The great majority of immigrants were single men in their late teens and early 20s, and most perished soon after arrival. Surviving males competed for the affections of the extremely scarce women, whom they outnumbered nearly 6 to 1 in 1650 and still outnumbered by 3 to 2 at the end of the century. Eligible women did not remain single for long. Families were both few and fragile in this ferocious environment. Most men could not find mates. Most marriages were destroyed by the death of a partner within 7 years. Scarcely any children reached adulthood under the care of two parents, and almost no one knew a grandparent. Weak family ties were reflected in the many pregnancies among unmarried young girls. In one Maryland county, more than a third of all brides were already pregnant when they wed. Yet despite these hardships, the Chesapeake colonies struggled on. The native-born inhabitants eventually acquired immunity to the killer diseases that had ravaged the original immigrants. The presence of more women allowed more families to form, and by the end of the 17th century the white population of the Chesapeake was growing on the basis of its own birth rate. As the 18th century opened, Virginia, with some 59,000 people, was the most populous colony. Maryland, with about 30,000, was the third largest, after Massachusetts. For the Historytellers, I'm Alexander Ryan.
Although unhealthy for human life, the Chesapeake was immensely hospitable to tobacco cultivation. Profit-hungry settlers often planted tobacco to sell before they planted corn to eat. But intense tobacco cultivation quickly exhausted the soil, creating a nearly insatiable demand for virgin land. Relentlessly seeking fresh fields to plant in tobacco, commercial growers plunged ever farther up the river valleys, provoking ever more Indian attacks. Leaf-laden ships annually hauled some 1.5 million pounds of tobacco out of Chesapeake Bay by the 1630s and almost 40 million pounds a year by the end of the century. This enormous production depressed prices, but colonial Chesapeake tobacco growers responded to falling prices in the familiar way of farmers by planting more acres of tobacco and bringing more product to market. More tobacco meant more labor, but where was it to come from? Families procreated too slowly to provide it by natural population increase. Indians died too quickly on contact with whites to be a reliable labor force, and African slaves cost too much money. But England still had a surplus of displaced farmers, desperate for employment. Many of them, as indentured servants, voluntarily mortgaged the sweat of their bodies for several years to Chesapeake masters. In exchange they received transatlantic passage and eventual freedom dues, including a few barrels of corn, a suit of clothes, and perhaps a small parcel of land. Both Virginia and Maryland employed a headright system to encourage the importation of servant workers. Under its terms, whoever paid the passage of the laborer received the right to acquire 50 acres of land. Masters, not the servants themselves, reaped the benefits of land ownership from the headright system. Some masters, men who already had at least modest financial means, soon parlayed their investments in servants into vast holdings in real estate. They became the great merchant planters, lords of sprawling riverfront estates that came to dominate the agriculture and commerce of the southern colonies. Ravenous for both labor and land, Chesapeake planters brought some 100,000 indentured servants to the region by 1700. These white slaves represented more than 3/4 of all European immigrants to Virginia and Maryland in the 17th century. Indentured servants led a hard but hopeful life in the early days of the Chesapeake settlements. They looked forward to becoming free and acquiring land of their own after completing their term of servitude. But as prime land became scarcer, masters became increasingly resistant to including land grants in freedom dues. The servants' lot grew harsher as the 17th century wore on. Misbehaving servants, such as a housemaid who became pregnant or a laborer who killed a hog, might be punished with an extended term of service. Even after formal freedom was granted, penniless freed workers often had little choice but to hire themselves out for pitifully low wages to their former masters. These frustrated freemen would band together and revolt under Nathaniel Bacon's banner. In our next segment, Gabrielle Renee reports on Bacon's rebellion.
An accumulating mass of footloose, impoverished freemen was drifting discontentedly about the Chesapeake region by the late 17th century. Mostly single young men, they were frustrated by their broken hopes of acquiring land, as well as by their gnawing failure to find single women to marry. The swelling numbers of these wretched bachelors rattled the established planters. The Virginia Assembly in 1670 disfranchised most of the landless knockabouts, accusing them of having little interest in the country and causing tumults at the election to the disturbance of His Majesty's peace. Virginia's Governor William Berkeley lamented his lot as ruler of this rabble. How miserable that man is that governs a people where 6 parts of 7 at least are poor, indebted, discontented, and armed. Berkeley's misery soon increased. About 1,000 Virginians broke out of control in 1676, led by a 29-year-old planter, Nathaniel Bacon. Many of the rebels were frontiersmen who had been forced into the untamed backcountry in search of arable land. They fiercely resented Berkeley's friendly policies toward the Indians, whose thriving fur trade the governor monopolized. When Berkeley refused to retaliate for a series of savage Indian attacks on frontier settlements, Bacon and his followers took matters into their own hands. They fell murderously upon the Indians, friendly and hostile alike, chased Berkeley from Jamestown, and put the torch to the capital. Chaos swept the raw colony, as frustrated freemen and resentful servants, described as a rabble of the basest sort of people, went on a rampage of plundering and pilfering. As this civil war in Virginia ground on, Bacon suddenly died of disease, like so many of his fellow colonists. Berkeley thereupon crushed the uprising with brutal cruelty, hanging more than 20 rebels. Back in England, Charles II complained that the old fool has put to death more people in that naked country than I did here for the murder of my father. The distant English king could scarcely imagine the depths of passion and fear that Bacon's rebellion excited in Virginia. Bacon had ignited the smoldering unhappiness of landless former servants, and he had pitted the hard-scrabble backcountry frontiersmen against the haughty gentry of the Tidewater plantations. The rebellion was now suppressed, but these tensions remained. Lordly planters, surrounded by a still seething sea of malcontents, anxiously looked about for less troublesome laborers to toil in the restless tobacco kingdom. Their eyes soon lit on Africa. For the Historytellers, I'm Gabrielle Renee.
Thank you for watching Part 1 of American Life in the 17th Century. In Part 2 we report on the origins of African slavery in the colonies and contrast the Virginia plantation society with the emerging New England social order. Remember, history is not a lecture to be heard, but a story to be told. For the Historytellers, I'm Jason Calvert. Good night.